And welcome back. When it comes to the question in the firewall's mind regarding how do I forward a packet to this network or that network or the other network, we have a few options available to us. And in this video, you and I get to discuss a few of those options. So I've titled this slide as Learning How to Reach Networks, or AKA also known as How to Forward. So let's say, for example, this device right here sends a packet to 42.96.43.9, that IP address. So when that packet is forwarded from the client to its default gateway, which is in this case Firewall 1 then needs to make a routing decision. It's going to consult its routing table and say, wow, how do I forward it? Do I forward it down this way or this way or this way? And not only which interface are we going to use, but also what is the next hop going to be in the path? So for example, if the packet is going out to the internet, the firewall should make the decision of forwarding it up here to R1, and then R1 would make a decision on how to forward it further towards its final destination. And so what I'd like to focus on is how do we train a firewall? And this also is applicable to our layer 3 router. How do we train one of those devices to actually reach a network? And there are 3 primary methods that a device can use to learn how to reach a given network. So over here, I'll make a column called how. And the number 1 option is a directly connected network, meaning that the firewall is directly connected to the network that it's trying to reach. And a directly connected network is very much like a street. So here's our street. There's a little line in the middle. Then we have some houses or buildings, and we have a driveway or some kind of path that goes to that street. So these houses, maybe this is house 101 on Elm Street. This is house 103 on Elm Street. So I'll label this as Elm Street. So if we ask the residents of either of these houses, hey, how do we get to Elm Street? They would say, look out the window. It's directly connected. It's right there. And that's very similar to how a firewall, if it has an interface configured on a given network, it knows how to reach those networks because it is directly connected. So on Firewall 1, when we configured port 4 and we assigned it the IP address of 23.1.2.71 with a 24-bit mask, once we clicked on OK, at that moment it said, oh, I'm connected to this logical network 23.1.2 using port 4. And because it was directly connected, that network is now part of the routing table or the information on how to reach networks that this firewall is maintaining. And the same thing happened with the DMZ. Once we took port 3 and assigned it the IP address of 172.16.1.71 with a 24-bit mask, it knew, oh wow, I'm directly connected to the 172.16.1 subnet. So that's our first option regarding how to train a device on how to reach a network. We can just directly connect it with one of its interfaces to that network. Another option for training this firewall on how to reach a given network is to create a static route. And static routes should be used sparingly. A static route is specific configuration that we put on the firewall that says, hey, to get to this network or that network, use this next hop to forward the packet. So for example, here on Firewall 1, we could say, hey, dear Mr. Firewall 1, in order to reach the 10.2.0 subnet, go ahead and forward it over to 10.123.0.72, which is the next hop address associated with port 4 on Firewall 2, and then Firewall 2 is directly connected to that network, and so it can forward the packet to the device on that 10.2 subnet. And we used a static route earlier when we configured a default route. We configured a static default route that said, hey, to get to anything that you don't have a more specific route for in your routing table, go ahead and send it to 23.1.2.1 as the next hop for your default route. So if a packet is sent to, for example, 3.4.5.99, that packet shows up at Firewall 1 because this PC is using Firewall 1 as its default gateway. And when that packet shows up, if the firewall doesn't have a more specific route in its routing table, this is a last-ditch effort. That's what the default route is. And it would say, well, okay, from a routing perspective, I need to forward that packet to the next hop associated with my default route, which in this case is 23.1.2.1. Now, just because the firewall knows how to route doesn't mean it's going to forward the packet, because there's also security policies in place and also rules we'll take a closer look at. But from a routing perspective, that's how the default route is used, in the event there's no other better, longer matching route in the routing table. However, static routes are kind of a pain, because if we have, let's say, we have 30 different subnets behind Firewall 2, and we have 45 more subnets behind Firewall 3, we don't want to have to create static routes for those or even summaries of those, because it becomes quite tedious. And if those networks change or we add new networks, now we have 31, we wouldn't want to have to go back and add a new static route. We'd want something more flexible that's auto-learning. And that brings us up to our third primary method for learning routes, and that is to use a routing protocol, also sometimes called a dynamic routing protocol, because we can allow these routing devices, including firewalls and other layer 3 routers, to talk with each other using the same rules or protocols with each other And they can share information. So for example, Firewall 2 could say, hey, I can reach the 10.2.0 network. It can dynamically advertise that to Firewall 1, who can then populate its routing table with no static route needed, because these two routers are dynamically communicating with each other using a dynamic routing protocol. And some examples of dynamic routing protocols could include things like Open Shortest Path First, or as its friends call it, OSPF, or a really old routing protocol that still works, but it's very, very old and not quite as efficient as some of the others, is RIP, Routing Information Protocol. And these are considered to be interior routing protocols. For example, a company with maybe a few hundred or a few thousand routes, they could pull off OSPF or RIP. But as we take a look at huge networks like the internet with hundreds of thousands of routes, we need something a little more industrial. And that industrial protocol that's also a dynamic routing protocol is BGP, the Border Gateway Protocol. And that's what we use on the internet today when service providers are exchanging routes with each other to provide reachability over the public internet. So OSPF, RIP, another example would be ISIS. In a Cisco environment, there's a routing protocol called EIGRP. But the logic is the same, and that is we're training our devices to communicate with each other so that we don't have to implement static routes everywhere on all of our routing devices. And many devices that support layer 3 forwarding, including these firewalls, support something called PBR, which is an acronym for policy-based routing. And here's an example. We might want the same path being used and the same route being used for like 99% of all our traffic. However, if we have a specific protocol that's being sent from a certain source address to a specific destination address, and we want to use a different route other than the standard route that's in the routing table, we can set up a policy that says, hey, if traffic matches this protocol and it's coming from this source address and going to this destination address, then go ahead and route it differently than what the current routing table shows. So think of policy-based routing as setting up hard-coded rules that are an exception to the way that the device normally routes. And all of these are examples of how a device, a routing device, can populate its routing table with static routes, directly connected networks, or with a dynamic routing protocol. And here's what you and I get to do as we proceed through these videos together. We're going to walk through examples of each of these so you can see them in action. So we'll continue this journey in the next video. I'll see you there in just a moment. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.